seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
Today we have a return visit from Lieutenant Colonel Jim Flowers, who is currently commander of the 507th Engineer Battalion in the Michigan National Guard. In the first interview session with him, he covered his early career through his deployment in Iraq. And just as a refresher here, during what time period were you in Iraq?
We entered into Iraq in June of 2003, and then we pulled out in June of 2004.
Okay. And what rank were you at when you came out of Iraq?
I was a captain and the company commander of the 1438th Engineer Detachment, which is a Michigan National Guard unit.
All right. And so once you get back to the States, let's just pick up a story from there. Now what happens?
Sure. You know, honestly, I have to say that coming back from my first combat deployment was a very peaceful event. Initially, we left theater, spent about, I want to say, a week or 10 days at Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, and that was kind of a period where we just chilled out, so to speak. There was some duty, like getting the equipment ready to ship back to the continental United States, but in reality, that gave the soldiers a little time to, you know, basically just chill out, get their heads together before we reunited with our friends, family, and loved ones. After we left Kuwait, we went back to our mobilization station, which was Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. And there we went through a series of out-processing events to include a pretty in-depth medical screening, blood draws. I think each of us met with the social worker to try to identify any sort of post-traumatic stress type events or anything along those lines. And a little bit of administrative paperwork as well to make sure that the soldiers maintained and were aware of additional resources and healthcare benefits for the 6 months that were to follow. From there, I guess one of the significant events was I had met with the Michigan Adjutant General the January prior when I was home on mid-tour leave, and he asked me if there's anything he could do, and I said, yes, sir, have a C-130 cargo plane waiting for us at Volk Field, Wisconsin, so that we can fly back to Grayling versus taking an 18-hour bus ride back. And true to his word, then Major General Tom Cutler, who was the Adjutant General, sure enough had a Michigan Air National Guard C-130 waiting at Volk Field for us. And there was a little spat between I think it was the First Army who ran the mobilization station and General Cutler, because the First Army wasn't quite ready to release us. General Cutler's like, the plane's there, they're getting on it. And I'm like, yes, sir, we're getting on the plane. So myself and my guys got on the plane, had about a 45-minute flight from Wisconsin across Lake Michigan, which was a real cool feeling, you know, flying across one of the Great Lakes after being in the desert for the better part of a year. And then we touched down at this little municipal airport in Grayling in a C-130, which is a fairly large aircraft for that airfield. And boy, talk about emotion and just adrenaline and everything else. We came off the ramp of the C-130, and, you know, maybe a couple hundred meters to our east, we could see all the families, the police, the fire trucks, the crowds, and I'm not going to say I didn't shed a few tears, but it was definitely one of those emotional high points of my life, and I know some of the soldiers as well. So had all the reunification of the soldiers and their families, and then we did a little, like a 30-minute program afterward, just, you know, basically, I think we pinned a few medals on some soldiers and, you know, expressed our thanks to all the support that we got from our Michigan higher headquarters, the local community, and more importantly, the families, because they really made a difference, I think, in a lot of the soldiers' lives. So got back to Grayling, and then life started again. And most of my soldiers are you know, the proverbial weekend warriors where they have a civilian job, a civilian life, and then they do the National Guard thing on the weekends. That actually went pretty good. We had a series of mandatory events. A lot of it was focused on reunification with families, some medical stuff. That chewed up about 3 or 4 months, and then we just basically got back into the battle rhythm of our normal training cycle. About, I want to say October of 2004, I got a call from my Engineer Brigade commander, and he asked, you know, hey Jim, would you like to go to Camp Darby, Italy in 2005 for a 3-week rotation? I'm like, it took about half a second to respond and said, yes sir, we'll do that happily. And it was a little, for a National Guard unit, it was a little bit of a quick turnaround to come back from a deployment, do some fast planning to go into a, you know, a completely different country again in about 8 months after our return. But we did, and had what I would call just a phenomenal, almost like an R&R type tour in Italy. We did work. We did several major construction projects at Camp Darby, which is near Pisa, Italy. And but we also had enough downtime to where we got to take in, you know, Florence, Rome, and some of the other Tuscan area tourist sites. So it was just a blast. And really, the soldiers that I see now that deployed with me and went with us on that Italy training assignment, you know, just call it one of the best military experiences that they ever had. And it was a big morale booster too, kind of like job well done in Iraq, you know, go to Italy for 3 weeks. So good to go there.
Okay. Now, when you went there, did you do anything with the Italians or any NATO forces, or was it just Americans?
It was pretty much just American. Camp Darby is just it's just a small post, really. It has some ammo storage capability, and its primary function is a logistics hub because of its location to air, rail, and then seaports. Makes it a prime venue to push stuff out to different parts of Europe and, you know, other areas of operations. So we did some road construction and repair in the ammo holding area. A favorite mission or construction operation was landscaping the American beach on the Tyrrhenian Sea. That was a tough one. But it was a big MWR venue for morale, welfare, and recreation venue for a lot of the European forces that were there at that time. So it had to be landscaped, and then we did several other just like facility construction and repair missions on Camp Darby proper. It was just really about a 2-week rotation, and then we chewed up another couple of days getting there and back, but had a blast.
Okay, so the Army's version of a vacation.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Now you go back again, and then it's sort of pick up where you left off with
Right.
drill training and so forth.
Right.
Now,
So in 2006, I finally rotated out of company command of the 1438th and had a real short tour as the S4 logistics officer for the Engineer Brigade for the 38th Infantry Division, which is no longer an activated or active division. But I only did that assignment for about 3 or 4 months, and then got picked up to do my first rotation to Afghanistan as an embedded trainer and advisor for the Afghan security forces. So the Afghan security forces are really just either the police or the Army or the Border Patrol, border forces. And when we were first notified of the assignment, we weren't sure which of those 3 components we were actually going to train. The train up itself lasted from about September of 2006 in Michigan, and then in February of 2007, we went to Fort Riley in Kansas and actually underwent about a 3 or 4 month very specified training regimen that focused predominantly on training and advising foreign forces, which, you know, if you dig into Army or military doctrine, is really a tenet that the special forces, you know, are primarily assigned to. But at that time, special ops was so involved with kinetic type operations, you know, kicking in doors, going after high value targets, that they didn't have enough special ops forces to train the literally thousands and thousands of Afghan forces that needed training. So they, you know, they called up brigades, basically, you know, 3,000 to 4,000 man formations, provided some specialty training at Fort Riley, and then kicked us out into theater. So backing up a little bit, February we got to Fort Riley, and then May is when we got boots on the ground in Afghanistan.
Okay. Now talk a little bit about, just like you said, you had some level of training while still in Michigan for several
Right.
months. What kind of stuff would get covered there?
A lot of it was tactical. The training and advising mission is really, when you boil it down, it's kind of an infantry mission. So we all had to, you know, bone up on our, you know, small unit tactics, you know, fire and maneuver, call for fire, which could be anything from calling in airstrikes to artillery or mortar fire. A lot of the basic, what I would call infantry skills that engineer officers and, you know, other officers that made up our small embedded trainer team just didn't get a chance to practice, you know, very often. So I call it as an opportunity to get in touch with my inner infantry officer, and really I enjoyed it. You know, you strap on a 50-pound rucksack and go do a 12-mile march. Yeah, it was definitely like going through infantry basic training again.
Right. And how many of you were going through this together at that point?
Michigan had two 16-man teams. One 16-man team was supposed to focus on company and battalion level training of the Afghan forces, and the other 16-man team would focus on the brigade echelon training and advising. So I was attached or assigned to the training team that had the company and battalion level. I was a major at the time. I guess I got promoted in 2006 to major, and I was the only one on the team who had done a combat deployment at that point, and they just decided me to put me at a company or battalion level because we were most likely to be engaged in some sort of combat operation as we got out into the field with our Afghan counterparts. So good call, I guess, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So the training in Michigan was primarily small unit tactics, some marksmanship, and a little just fundamentals of what we call close quarters combat, how to stack up on a building and enter it, and then, you know, basically clear rooms from one level to the next.
Right. Okay, and then the Fort Riley component, what were they doing there?
Right, a lot more in depth and more focused on, you know, what skills you need to train foreign forces. In this case, we knew it was going to be Afghanistan. A lot of language, spent about 120 hours in language lab learning primarily the Dari language, which I believe is a Farsi dialect, and a little bit of Pashto. A lot of cultural immersion training because Afghanistan is a multi-tribal country, and really a country that, although there's international borders, those borders are not necessarily recognized by the people of Afghanistan, such as the case between the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which we know is Waziristan, and what the Afghan people, you know, still believe is part of their country. Anyway, so a lot of cultural immersion, a lot more in-depth infantry type training. We would go on squad level live fire exercises, meaning live ammunition, you know, conducting individual movements to targets and clearing an objective. Some driver's training, because by that time the up-armored Humvees and other vehicles had entered theater and, you know, were 11 plus tons, and operating those things is a lot different than getting into a light-skinned Humvee, which is about half the weight. Just to put it in perspective, you know, driving like a Willys Jeep or a Jeep Wrangler versus driving, you know, a semi-tractor trailer. It's just the feel and operation of those vehicles is a lot different. Some what we would call heavy weapons training, little mortar training, 50 caliber machine guns, other automatic weapon systems, and just kind of mastering a whole host of communication systems to include satellite communications and other secure communications that we would use once we were in theater.
Right. Now, how do you do cultural immersion for Afghanistan when you're in Kansas?
Good question. The Department of Defense actually contracted a lot of Afghan, now U.S. citizens who, these would be the guys that fled Afghanistan in the 80s when the Russians invaded. So they had a couple of decades in the U.S., but still, maintained ties back in Afghanistan. So those folks, and there were quite a few of them, came in and they did the language training with us, and they also ran us through a series of just live training exercises where we would have to go in. They would role play like a village elder or maybe a senior Afghan officer or even a junior Afghan officer. You'd be presented with a scenario and you'd have to role play or work through that, and then they would critique you at the end and say, hey, if you do that in Afghanistan, these guys are, not going to cooperate or worse. Or, in some cases, they'd be like, good job, it's important to, not dive into a conversation with an Afghan, business first. You have to take your time and, hey, how's your family? It's a pleasure to meet you. The first hour of a conversation could be just real light talk before you ever get into anything mission or operationally oriented.
All right. Now, did any of that turn out to be useful?
It did, and some of it, my only critique, and I called one of the guys on it once. I said, well, you haven't been in Afghanistan in over 20 years, and you're, telling me how it is. I'm like, why don't you come join us? And he kind of smirked at that, but I'm like, I'm going over there. Why don't you come on over there? And anyway, I think I was frustrated that day and just was kind of taking it out on him. But the point was, you guys have been away for a while, and there's a lot has changed in that 20 years. And some of the stuff that they taught us was useful, and other things we really had to learn on the fly. Being an embedded trainer, you really have to be a jack of all trades because you go out on mission very light. In other words, maybe 4 or 5 guys in a couple of vehicles with 200 or 300 Afghans, and that's it. You might have some additional NATO forces, or you may not. So you gotta be on your game at all times, but fun mission.
All right. So you complete the training course at Fort Riley, and so now when do you go to Afghanistan?
May of 2007, we were wheels down at Kabul International Airport. Never forget that day. I think we got in right at dusk, if I'm not mistaken. We were kind of herded into an assembly area because there were, 200 or 300 guys on the plane. Herded into an assembly area. We moved from the airport to Camp Phoenix, which is also located in Kabul, and the flagpole or the headquarters of Task Force Phoenix, which was the brigade level echelon responsible for the theater-wide advising and training of the Afghan security forces. So it was about a 15-minute ride in the back of a armored cargo truck, from the airport to Camp Phoenix. And then we basically were at Camp Phoenix for 10 days and started to get our initial assignments, regarding which units and which security forces we were actually going to train.
All right. And what are you kind of learning about the situation in that time?
Well, a lot of confusion. The training and advising mission was so broad, but yet fairly ill-defined. It was kind of like, you've heard the analogy of building an aircraft in flight. That's it. I mean, really, we didn't know which units we were going to be assigned to until we got to Camp Phoenix, which is a little bit odd. That's not how the U.S. military typically operates. And we didn't even know what geographical locations we were going to be assigned to throughout the country until a couple weeks into Afghanistan. So initially, my embedded trainer team was assigned to training the Afghan civil order police. We call them ANCOP. and they were like the SWAT team guys of the Afghan police. So your typical Afghan police force is undereducated, more militia than law enforcement as we would understand it. The ANCOP had a little bit higher selection criteria to get it to join that force. They had to have at least an 8th grade education, pass a reading and writing proficiency test, and also have an initial security screening to try to weed out the Taliban infiltrators. They got that about 80% right. But anyway, so we were assigned to the ANCOP brigade, which was actually posted or just standing up in Kabul proper. So we kind of spread out from Camp Phoenix. Our initial posting was FOB, Forward Operating Base Black Horse, which was a little farther east from the inner city of Kabul. And it was also nested right in the middle of the Afghan, I want to say it was the 201st Corps Army, Afghan National Army. So you have a little U.S. and NATO force footprint that's surrounded by a core of Afghan National Security Forces. So that was about week 3 or 4, and at that point we got a pretty good sense about the immensity and the challenges of the training and advising mission. Just the facilities were bad, the equipment was bad. You could tell that the discipline of the Afghan army was not something that even came close to the discipline and training of U.S. or other NATO forces. So you started to get a really good sense of, oh boy, it's going to be an interesting year. So fast forward a little bit, we trained in Kabul for about 3 months. This would be starting to get into the October-November time frame. And then we get the order or the mission that our higher headquarters, working with the Afghan Ministry of Defense, wanted to put into effect a program called Focus District Development, FDD. What that turned out to be was the ANCOP forces would go into a local, quite often remote area, do a relief in place of the existing police forces so that the existing police forces could go to a formal training site and facility and then come back and reoccupy the area after they were trained. That's Focus District Development 101. So along with that came a lot of planning and logistical movement, which the Afghan forces just aren't used to. We worked them through some of the staff planning and the operational planning phases, plus some tactical training as well. And then long about late November, first part of December, actually took a company of ANCOP police officers to a small district south of Gardez, Afghanistan, called Zorat, Z-O-R-M-A-T. And Zorat is very close to the area of operations where I think back in 2003 or 2004, the U.S. was engaged in a real fight. And there was a book called Not a Good Day to Die, I think, and that it involved the 10th Mountain, some special operating forces, etc. And anyway, a long drawn-out fight in that area a couple years prior. So anyway, we get down to Zorat. We do the relief in place of the existing police forces. They go off to Jalalabad for training, and we're in Zorat proper for about 3 months. And the battle space owner in that area was a cavalry squadron from the 82nd Airborne. I think it was the 473 Cav Squadron from the 82nd Airborne. So they were responsible for the greater Gardez area of operations, to include everything up to the Pakistan border.
Okay. So is this kind of hilly or mountainous terrain that you're in, or?
It's mixed. You had Zorat actually sat in a basin surrounded by mountains, and the closer you got to Gardez, the more mountainous it got. But Zorat itself was had mountain ranges on both sides of it, in addition to some flat agricultural and arid type terrain.
Okay. And was there much Taliban activity in that area at that time? Or?
We got there in December, so the fighting season, as we refer to it, really had ended about a month prior to that. I say that lightly because on our initial movement from Gardez to Zorat, we passed a fuel truck that was still burning and on fire, and literally 24 hours prior to that had been hit with by an RPG attack and killed several of the Afghan police that we were to relieve. So, you know, the majority of the fighting was over, but not really. And within that first 24 hours, you know, we got established at the small base at Zorat, which really was occupied by a troop or a company of the Cav Squadron I just referred to. And they had just, after that fuel truck had been hit by an RPG, had called in an airstrike on the RPG trigger pullers, and actually had several of the dead Taliban attackers kind of stacked up and covered at the police district center that we rolled into. So that was our welcome to Zorat, and kind of a good reality check for the stuff that was to come. But the fighting proper really was not as intense as it was going to be in the spring and the summer.
Okay. Now, what did you make of the Afghans that you were assigned to you, these ANCOP people?
Yeah, fortunately we did some pretty intense training with them for, you know, 3 months prior to moving down. So we had built, you know, whatever level of trust and respect that we had between us. It gave me a good sense of who were the top tier soldiers or police officers, and who were the guys that I wouldn't necessarily want to go out on a mission with. So establishing that rapport was key. Identifying the core group of Afghan police officers that we would be operational with was very vital. And also just, how do I want to put it? Just, if nothing else, just building that relationship with them helped. I think if we would have dove into an operation without having a few months to train, it would have been a lot different experience.
Yeah. As far as you could tell, what was their understanding of what they were doing or why they were doing it?
Yeah, there was actually a disconnect. The commander, the ANCOP commander, which would be the equivalent of a company commander, so about 150 police officers, he understood his mission was primarily just to secure the district center in Zorat. And the district center would be like the municipal center of any village or city, you know, in the U.S. It had the mayor, it had the police department, it had a couple of other sub-ministers of, you know, agriculture or education or, you know, typical municipal functions. So that was his understanding. We just have to secure this little, you know, 100 meter by 100 meter complex. And I'm like, well, that's not really what we're down here to do. You know, we had done some training in what they call community policing, which is where the police forces actually go out into the communities, you know, introduce themselves to the community leadership and say, you know, we're here to help, not necessarily beat you down for money at checkpoints. So we had to reintroduce that, and the biggest challenge was letting these guys, the ANCOP, know that there's an operational aspect to this. You know, there's going to be some raids, there's going to be what we call cordon and search, there's going to be, you know, the calls in the middle of the night where a high-value target is located, and we're going to be part of that. And initially there was some resistance, and I think some phone calls back and forth, but we worked through all of that and kind of came to the gentleman's agreement that I would have a core operational force of about 45 guys, which was really a platoon. And we would use that ANCOP platoon to basically assist the cavalry troop and squadron with some of the operations that they had going on, for the primary reason that at that point, any kinetic operation or combat operation was supposed to be Afghan-led. And we were trying to put the Afghan face on, you know, the security and, you know, the close fight with the Taliban. And, you know, for that reason, the ANCOP really had a big piece to play in that.
Okay. Now, and do you get to start practicing that before the spring, or is it really when the spring comes that things start to happen?
We pulled out of Zorat in March, I think, for a couple of different reasons. The forces that were replacing us were just starting to show up in theater, so we had to do a little bit of a battle handoff, a little bit. But we also had the newly trained police forces that we relieved were now coming back from their training, and really we were just going to lift and shift to a different location. So the 3 months that we were at Zorat were really quite busy. We had several known checkpoints set up, and those checkpoints really were just like little security outposts to facilitate movement from, say, Gardez to Zorat, and then from Zorat down to some of the southern locations. But historically, when the police had manned those checkpoints, they were an area or a point where the police would basically solicit money or bribes, you know, from the local populace moving up and down that route. The ANCOP changed that. When people were traveling, the Afghan people or commerce was traveling those routes, the ANCOP let them pass without having to pay a toll, if you will. And that was a remarkable change, and so well received by everybody that, you know, it made it up to the governor level in Gardez, and, you know, was really well received. That was one thing. But another mission for the ANCOP was they would escort these convoys of commercial trucks from Zorat down to some of the southern locations and provide them with security free of charge, which was another rare concept for the Afghan truck drivers. And, you know, some got shot at, et cetera, but most of them made the passage without too much issue. And then we had the operational aspect with the Cav Squadron, where, you know, we were actually doing raids, cordon and search operations, and on 2 or 3 occasions were sent out to snag some high-value targets. So, and I can get into that a little bit if you want.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, so the month of January of 2008 was really a month-long operation, and I can't even remember the name of the operation now, but that was something that was jointly planned with the 473 Cav Squadron, my guys, which consisted of myself, 2 NCOs and my interpreter, and then I think I had a couple of other NCOs. I only had 5 guys on my team, so pretty light. But we walked through some of the traditional military operational planning cycles and phases with our Afghan counterparts, produced a written operations order, and then, you know, pulled the trigger to go do basically a month-long cordon and search of the greater Zorat area, probably a 20 or 30 mile radius area. The intent of that operation was to disrupt the logistics hubs for the Taliban, so that when Taliban would come back across the border in the spring to start the spring offensive, they'd come in on empty logistics hubs to include, you know, hey, no weapons, no ammo, for the sole reason that we were searching house by house, barn by barn, cave by cave, everywhere in that area to, you know, see if we could find anything that would aid the Taliban. So we're actually pretty successful in that respect. I forget the actual roll-up, but you know, not every house is gonna have a logistics or a cache of weapons for the Taliban, but I would say about 1 in 20 or 30 houses does. So it's kind of like a big Easter egg hunt. And that's how I look at it. You know, essentially, the U.S. forces would go in and set up a larger security ring around a village or a kulat, which is a walled complex in Afghanistan. And the Afghan army would set up kind of a closer security ring. And then my team and the ANCOP would actually go in these structures and do the searches for the weapons caches. So, yeah, we were definitely up close and personal with all that stuff. And bottom line, we got a lot of weapons and ammunition and some additional supplies. And on one occasion, a couple documents that were a pretty high intelligence value that we turned over to the guys who look at that. Right?
Yeah, okay. Now, how well did your ANCOP people perform on this?
Really good. Again, I had a corps of about 30 or 40 police officers that I consider the top tier police officers. They did really, really well. They responded well to their lieutenant. Their lieutenant worked well with me and vice versa. And basically, you know, we got so good at what we were doing that, you know, really all we had to do was roll up on a complex and they were on it. You didn't even have to tell them what to do. So, and that was really cool to watch their progression. So at the end of the day, really we were there in more of an advisor role than we were a trainer role, which was really an end state that we were trying to achieve.
So you didn't really have issues with them not really wanting to do the job or letting stuff slip by them, or?
Nope, not that group. You know, that wasn't the case for some of the other training teams that were out in different areas. But the guys I had, I would have gone and done a mission with them anywhere. Sometimes they needed a little. I'm not going to say it wasn't frustrating, because it was. But, you know, you just work through all that and you just factor that into any operation. You know, they're going to show up at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're supposed to, you know, begin your movement. They're going to be like, we don't have any fuel. You're like, well, what'd you do with the fuel that you had? Well, we don't have it. Well, it means they sold it, you know, because they needed a little extra cash, and now you have to find fuel for them. But, I mean, that kind of stuff you just work through. And it's a little thing at the end of the day. As long as they show up with the right amount of personnel, the trucks, they got their weapons, you know, and they understand the mission, that's success for those guys.
Okay. Now then, you're in that area for a while. When you move out of that area, now what do you do?
We went back to Kabul just for a couple of weeks, and then at the beginning I indicated that we had 16 guys total on my team, and we each were missioned out to a different geographical location, and all of us were shorthanded. So after we completed the Zorat mission, we went to just a small ANCOP outpost south of Jalalabad, and the name escapes me, but it was just a small like sandbag HESCO barrier outpost south of Jalalabad to assist one of our other training teams. And that particular group of ANCOP was, I don't think they were the same quality or caliber that I was used to in the Zorat. They still needed a lot of training. They weren't as eager to go out on any sort of operational mission, and you get that. It's just, you know, different forces are going to behave differently, even in the U.S. military. So the mission down there was pretty much just to have a force present in that area south of Jalalabad, just for the presence of soldiers. But the cool thing there, we did several patrols with, in fact, it was the 173rd Airborne that was the battle space owner down there. And it was an engineer sapper company that was the closest military facility to us. We did some joint patrolling with them, you know, some night overwatch type operations. We did some checkpoints. We did a couple humanitarian assistance missions, which are always interesting to do, and not a lot of kinetic stuff, but a lot of presence patrolling, I guess is the best way to put it.
What kind of humanitarian missions were you doing?
Well, this is very interesting. So we were at that location for about 2 weeks, I think it was, and somehow we got the word that the Minister of Education for the little locality that we were at had received a bunch of cooking oil and some other supplies from, what's the big relief agency? Not UNICEF, but it's something that supplies food to third world countries. Right. And he was this education minister was somewhat hoarding this and not distributing it. So we spun up a quick raid of his kalat, went inside, and lo and behold, here's thousands of gallons of or thousands of tin containers of cooking oil that are just sitting there. And when confronted, we're like, hey, what's going on with this? How come you're not distributing it to the people it was intended for? His excuse was, well, there's not enough to give to everybody, so therefore I'm not going to give any to anybody. And we're like, well, all right, that's really not what we're supposed to do with this. So we loaded it all up, went back into the village area, and started handing this stuff out. Well, any humanitarian assistance mission can quickly get out of control because my experience is that the Afghans will actually mob the truck and try to take as much as they can. And we had pretty good security, and we used the ANCOP to kind of control the crowds, but I'm here to tell you it was a bit unnerving. You had maybe 20 or 30 of us and 2,000 or 3,000 Afghans, and they could have overrun us pretty quick. But we distributed the cooking oil and basically wrote it off as mission success. The other mission we did, there was a little school located right next to our observation post, and my wife had sent 20 or 30 boxes of school supplies and books and pens and crayons and stuffed animals, backpacks, you name it. And we decided, as a measure of goodwill, to try to set up, just an exchange of those school supplies to that local school. Trying to, again, just trying to let the local populace know that, unlike previous police, we're not there just to beat them down for money or whatever purpose. But so we did a school supply humanitarian assistance mission with that local school. It was a cool experience. There's maybe 200 or 300 kids at the school. We had to get permission from all the parents because, Afghan schools, they do segregate the boys from the girls. So basically we had to get permission to go into like a girls' classroom, and give gifts. So again, there's a lot of, anytime you do something like that, there's a ton of cultural sensitivities that you have to think about. But as long as you work it through, in this case, we worked it through the school headmaster, our interpreters, and we really had the ANCOP lieutenant or captain be the facilitator for that. So the interaction was primarily Afghan. The American forces were there just to, lift the boxes out of the trucks. So it was kind of one of the cooler events, I would say, in Afghanistan.
Okay. Now, as you're going in these different places, whether it's Kabul or Zorat or now Jalalabad area, what kind of attitude do the Afghan civilians seem to have toward you?
Ooh, it really varied, depending on what area you were in. Kabul is just an enormous city, dirty, filthy. The people were very used to NATO forces and almost became indifferent to them. The more remote you got, the more you really had to work at establishing some relationship. Almost everywhere I went, it wasn't uncommon to have kids throw rocks at your vehicle or worse. A lot of the local populace, if you make a friendly gesture toward them, their culture requires them to make a friendly gesture back to you. Spent a lot of time, with village elders and leaders drinking tea or chai, just sitting down and having a conversation. And it was always quite cordial. They would hit some sensitive topics from time to time, but you know, you could go back through those same areas a week or two later and take some small arms fire, or you know, possibly an IED or something like that. So it's just a different culture to get your head around. But I will just say this: the more remote you get, the less friendly they were to American or NATO forces, particularly toward the Pakistan border and in the southern part of the country.
Okay. All right. Now, so how long does the Jalalabad area stint go on?
We were there for about 2 months, and then, honestly, I think by that time we were ready to pull out. We did a couple relief-in-place operations. We staged some additional ANCOP forces and the embedded trainers that were replacing us in Ghazni, which is kind of south central Afghanistan. So basically, I did 2 primary operational missions: Zorat, and then the outpost south of Jalalabad. And then by that time, we were really staging our relief forces in their areas of operation. This whole time, the focus district development is occurring. In other words, the ANCOP are going into an area, the local militia or police are going off to be trained, and we're switching locations about every 2 or 3 months.
Okay. So you're not there then for like a full year's tour in the old
We did. We were there
Okay.
from May to May.
Okay.
And I think my last operational mission was running a convoy of ANCOP and our relief forces down to Ghazni and getting them situated in their areas of operation. And that would have been late April timeframe. So the spring offensive was just starting to kick up a little bit. And in terms of, what were the high points, I guess, of that deployment? We did take down Taliban district commander in the Zorat area. I had the pleasure of greeting that gentleman at the doorway and basically putting my rifle in his face. And we took him alive, which was an anomaly, I guess. All in all, in Zorat, we captured and detained around 40 Taliban fighters, a ton of weapons and ammo, and let me see if I can think of any other things. Responded to numerous IED type incidents, but those were kind of the operational high points of that tour.
Now, were your teams taking any casualties themselves, or the Afghans you were with, or?
My guys didn't sustain any casualties. The Cav squadron had some wounded and some KIA, and our ANCOP forces had a couple guys wounded from IEDs. But again, my guys walked out of that. Now, some of my other teammates, the 16 guys I was referring to, we had a couple of those guys were injured during some IED blasts. But at the end of that tour, all 16 of us got back on the plane and made it back to the States. Good to go.
All right, just another question. How is it that you were the guy confronting the Taliban commander? I mean, is that not kind of normal to have a unit commander be the guy to go in first? Or?
It's just how it worked out.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you're 100% right. But we got some intel like the night before that this Taliban district commander was holed up in a certain location, and so we put together a patrol and a raid to include a couple platoons from the Cav squadron and then our ANCOP guys, and we all kind of converged on this Kulat complex, and then we weren't quite sure exactly what building he was in. We had a pretty good idea because of some informants and other capabilities. So we really had him narrowed down to about 6 different structures. So we just methodically started working the different structures, and for some reason, my interpreter was in front of a gate or a door, and I said, "Hey, Ghazi, pound on that door real quick and have one of the males from the household come out. I just want to talk to him." So Ghazi, who was my interpreter, pounded on the door. A young man of about 13 or 14 came out, and some conversation occurred between my interpreter and the young man. Ghazi looked at me and said, "He's in here." And I said, "All right, that's all I need to know." So I about that time, as I was calling for my team to kind of converge on this culotte, I saw the gentleman we were after, because we had a photo of him. He was moving around, so I just ran in at that point and put my rifle in his face, and he got the message at that point. Fortunately, he didn't have time to get to any weapons, because we wouldn't have taken him alive if that would have been the case. But it's just how it worked out. It's under normal circumstances, it probably would have been the ANCOP going in or something along those lines, but that's how stuff happens in Afghanistan.
All right. Now, during this year that you're spending there, how much contact do you have with home?
Internet was spotty, and the deal I had worked out with my wife was I would just simply say, "Hey, hon, I'm going to be out of any form of communication for 3 or 4 days." She'd be like, "Okay, just send me an email when you get back." I did have a satellite phone, so I would call her once a week on the sat phone, and normally email her 2 or 3 times a week if we had email capability. A lot of times we were so remote we didn't have just regular email capability, but I would typically find a way to stay in contact with her once a week by phone, and then email when available.
And I guess the people on the team are all officers or senior non-coms, so they're
Right.
people they are professionals and
Yes.
so forth. Not the same as having some 19 and 20-year-old kids along that you got to
Exactly.
look after and
Yeah,
deal with.
I was blessed with my team. My E7 Sergeant First Class was actually a Washington, D.C. homicide detective, perfect for the job we were at. And then my E6 was he was like a construction contractor, which came in handy because we actually built some stuff. And then a couple of other guys that I had, one was a IT tech, and that was pretty much it. But we were all kind of, we pooled our civilian skills with our military skills. And my non-coms, non-commissioned officers, some of them were infantry 11 Bravos, and I was an engineer officer. But anyway, the combination worked out really, really well. So, yeah, I was fortunate with my team.
All right. And now you get back home, and now what do they do with you?
Kind of the same thing, very similar to when I got back from Iraq. We went back, we went from Afghanistan to Kuwait, stayed about another week in Kuwait. Same thing, decompress a little bit, chill out. Flew back to Fort Riley, went through the same out-processing, medical, turned in all of our equipment, did some administrative paperwork stuff, and then I hit the repeat button on the plane request. So my wife, who had established kind of like a family readiness group relationship with General Cutler at that time, did the footwork for me. And General Cutler is the Adjutant General still of Michigan. She's like, "Hey, remember what we did, when Jim and the guys came back from Iraq? Let's do that again, so that they don't have to do a bus or separate flights back from Fort Riley, back to Michigan." So the way that worked is the Michigan Air Guard has KC-135 tankers. It's a Boeing 707 that does in-flight refueling. And they flew one of those out to one of the, airports near Fort Riley. We all got on the KC-135. Hour and a half later, landed at the Lansing Capitol Airport, got off the plane, and reunited with our families. So again, a very, very cool experience.
And I guess you can fly in a fuel tanker because there's not that many of you.
Yeah, exactly. There was less than 40 of us, I think. So, not the most comfortable ride, but you don't care at that point.
All right. So now when are you back home?
We got back late May, early June of 2008.
Okay. And now do you go back into the regular routine, or do you get a different unit, or what happens to you?
Where did I go? During the last couple months of my deployment in Afghanistan, I knew I was going to fill what they call a S3 operations officer position with the 507th Engineer Battalion, which is the battalion I command now. So that was going to be my next military assignment, but I also knew I had to do the Command and General Staff College out at Fort Leavenworth in 2009, I think it was. So I went into the operations officer position for about 4 months, and then in January of 2009 actually did a PCS move out to Fort Leavenworth to get set up and attend the year-long Command and General Staff course at Fort Leavenworth.
All right. So now does your family go with you, or?
Yes, yeah. My wife came with me for that move. And at that point, my kids are all grown and out of the house, so it made that move a little bit easier.
All right. Now, what do you actually do in that year of schooling?
Yeah, it's the Command and General Staff College is really, really cool. It's been around for, early 1900s. Most of our, famous and infamous generals, Patton, MacArthur, Eisenhower, they all went through the same, school or college at Fort Leavenworth. It really introduces the field grade officer, in this case, most of us were majors, to strategic level planning, brigade and division level operations and planning, military history, military leadership, a lot of military doctrine, and the latter part of the course you can select from a myriad of electives. For example, I did European strategic studies, African strategic studies, Latin American strategic studies. I did a language course, and just you name it, they have an elective for it. The cool thing about that year is that it's open to all branches of the military, so we had Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps officers attending. It's predominantly Army, but you get a good mix of all the other branches. But you also get a lot of military officers from different countries. Most of our NATO allies, a lot of Middle Eastern countries send officers to that school, so it's really an international school is what it is. And for example, in my small group, which was about 16 students, we had a major from Ethiopia who was assigned to us, and I was kind of assigned to him as a student ambassador and got to know him pretty well. He's now a full bird colonel in the Ethiopian Army, which I think is just cool.
All right. So you complete this. It's now in 2010 when you're done, or?
Yep, right at the end of 2009. It went from January 2009 to December 2009. Just prior to leaving the Command and General Staff College, I got notified that I was going to go into the executive officer position for the 507th Engineer Battalion, and they were sourced or notified for a 2010 Afghanistan deployment. And I'm like, holy cripe, this is a non-stop whirlwind here. But as it turns out, that mission was canceled or put on hold, I think is a better way to put it. They just kind of shifted it to 2012, it being the deployment. But so rejoined the 507th in 2010 as the executive officer. Real high operational tempo for a National Guard unit. We were getting ready to do a rotation at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California. That is a big deal. A lot of planning has to go into that. So, I just kind of dove into that feet first. But I also got picked up on full-time orders to be the operations officer for the 46 MP Command, who was currently deployed to Afghanistan. So I was kind of their rear detachment training and operations officer. Subsequently, the 46 MP Command was a higher headquarters of the 507th Engineer Battalion, so it worked out well. I was able to be on full-time orders while the 507th was ramping up for, you know, an impending Afghanistan deployment. The National Training Center exercise was in April of 2010, and it's about a month-long exercise from start to finish. And we were there with I want to say the 4th Brigade of the 1st Armor Division, who was what they call the rotational unit, and the 4-1 was getting ready to go do a deployment in support of Operation New Dawn, which replaced Operation Iraqi Freedom, I guess. And anyway, it was a tough rotation. Learned a lot of good lessons at NTC, and then moving on to 2011, we were re-notified or resourced that we would be deploying to Afghanistan in 2012, primarily to do mission command of route clearance, you know, counter-IED operations in southwestern Afghanistan.
Yeah. So a proper engineer unit function this time, as opposed to some of the other things that you were doing before.
Exactly, yeah.
All right. Now, what do you do to prepare a battalion to go over?
It's really, wow, it's so multifaceted. Normally, you know, step one is to figure out which units you're going to be the higher headquarters for. And it's a little bit of a challenge to do that. And the bottom line is we had National Guard units, we had Army Reserve units, and we had active duty units that basically made up the 1,000-man task force that we were going to command in Afghanistan. So there were a lot of video conferences with our subordinate units just to introduce ourselves, you know, exchange standard operating procedures, checklists, those type of things. But the training itself at that time was pretty regimented. First Army, who was the echelon responsible for training reserve component units going into theater, has a whole list of what they call warrior tasks and battle drills that every soldier has to go through. It's everything from throwing a hand grenade to doing you know, if you're E7 and above, you have to know how to call in artillery support, air support. Again, some cultural immersion and a little bit of language type things. So the training is busy from the soldier level to the senior leader level. And it's all basic soldier stuff.
Now, are your guardsmen, are they just still doing this on the weekend schedule, or?
We do. When a unit is sourced, they actually get about double the amount of training time normally allocated to a National Guard unit. So you wind up doing 2 or 3 different annual, 2-week annual training periods and about twice the amount of weekends that you would normally do. In addition, because of the mission, there's a lot of specialty schools that the soldiers had to go to. We sent an officer to I think the 6-month-long electronic warfare officer school. A lot of our combat engineers had to go through specialized route clearance, counter-IED training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Those were anywhere from 4 to 8 week courses. Myself, my commander, and a couple of the company commanders actually did a leader's recon to Afghanistan prior to our main unit deployment over there. That was a 2-week ordeal. So it's just busy, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Okay, describe a little bit that commander's recon thing that you went on.
Yep, I'm trying to remember. We got into Afghanistan. The main body moved into Afghanistan proper in June of 2012. So we did the leader's recon, I want to say January or February of 2012, and it was just a small contingent. Myself, my commander, our command sergeant major, and 2 or 3 of our company commanders. And the unit, the purpose of the leader's recon is to basically get a lot more in-depth briefs from the unit that you're replacing. In this case, it was the 14th Engineer Battalion out of Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington, and they were an active duty unit. So we met with them. They kind of gave us a lay of the land. We were able to, get out and about to some of the different locations that the subordinate units operated in, and get some in-depth classified briefs on, current tactics and procedures that the Taliban and other anti-coalition forces were using. Really, you only get, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 days out of the 2 weeks because you're chewing up a week just traveling in and out of Afghanistan. But that was pretty much the gist of that leader's recon.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that your unit is going to be have about a total of about 1,000 people in it that
Yeah.
you're drawing, but some of them are from units other than your own core group in the 507th, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
So, but what proportion of that 1,000 would be your own people out of the unit from
Really,
Kansas?
just 2 companies. We had our headquarters company, which is about 75 soldiers that is responsible for securing and moving the battalion headquarters. And we had our field support company, which does the maintenance and the logistics operations for a battalion or task force size echelon. Everybody else was different. So we took we didn't take any of our organic companies other than the HHC and the FSC. We had a engineer sapper company from South Dakota. We had another combat engineer company from Montana. We had a bridge company, a military bridge company from California. We had a route clearance company from Fort Hood, Texas, active duty. We had another sapper company from New York, Army National Guard. Then we had a sapper company from Kentucky that was Army Reserve. So together, that task force was about 1,000 soldiers, if not more.
And for a general audience, what's the difference between a sapper and a conventional engineer?
A sapper company are all combat engineers. Their MOS is 12 Bravo, and basically their specialized training is laying in minefields, breaching obstacles, demolitions type operations. They also can reorganize and fight as infantry. A lot of the other engineer companies are very construction oriented. They either do horizontal or vertical construction. We have dive teams. We have bridge companies. In this case, we did actually have a bridge company. So they do a lot more of the specialized construction. But in this case, with the exception of the bridge company, all of our subordinate units were responsible for doing route clearance, counter-IED operations, and Regional Command Southwest Afghanistan and Regional Command West Afghanistan. Our battle space was literally the size of Wyoming and about 1/3 of the country of Afghanistan.
Right. Yeah. So you're away from the Pakistan border and the mountains and what we tend to
Yes.
associate with missions in Afghanistan, but really missions are going on all around the country.
Right, right. The bridge company actually was the theater bridge asset. So they could do a bridge operation, where we were at in southwestern Afghanistan, Camp Leatherneck and Camp Bastion, but they could be missioned out to northern Afghanistan, eastern Afghanistan, anywhere there was a bridge operation. The predominant river systems in Afghanistan are in the southern part of the country, though. The Helmand River is a prime example.
Okay. All right. So you get all the stuff ready. So when do you leave then with the whole unit?
We departed. Where did we mobilize out of? We mobilized out of Fort Bliss, Texas. We spent about a month down at Fort Bliss, Texas, basically the month of May of 2012, just doing some additional training, some additional evaluations. I was on the advance party going into Afghanistan, so I got in with I had a contingent of about 7 other soldiers. We got in D-Day. It was June 6th and June 7th of 2012. We departed Kuwait and flew into Afghanistan. So I think that's always a cool, we can put together the major military historic events with past and present, kind of a cool thing. But So we got in the first part of June. The main body followed us about a week later. They actually came in through, I want to, oh shoot, Manis, which is Uzbekistan? One of the other stands north of Afghanistan. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, one of them. Tajikistan. Yeah. So they came in through Manis airfield. We linked up, had about a 2-week relief in place with the 14th Engineer Battalion, who was right in the middle of a major operation. And I guess that's a big learning point. When you get into theater, you know, as I referred to during session 1 of this interview, when you get into theater, it is game on immediately. You don't get time, you don't get, you know, you can't push the replay button. You have to be ready for operations immediately, and such was the case with us. And our task force name was Task Force Warhammer, and so 2 weeks after the relief in place, we were in the middle of a major operation called Operation Shrimp Net, which was a large base closure and Counter-IED operation in southwestern Afghanistan. And it was one of those operations where every day we were taking casualties, and our equipment was being destroyed by IEDs at just almost an unsustainable rate. We made it through. We didn't have any KIA soldiers. We had a number that were wounded pretty severely by IEDs, but at the end of the operation, you know, we succeeded at closing down a couple of remote bases that tied into the larger plan to reduce the size of the NATO footprint.
Okay, so you're essentially trying to leave when they're still giving you trouble.
Yes, yeah. The guys we replaced are leaving as we're just getting in.
Right,
and
but you're shutting down bases,
oh yeah,
so that
right.
we're leaving too, in that sense, yeah.
One way in, one way out, and the bad guys know where you're going and where you're coming back out of, so.
Okay, and you're anti-IED people, and you're still getting blown up by the IEDs. Were they just coming up with things that you hadn't thought of yet, or?
Some of them, they're just hard to detect, and I mean, there's a lot of technology. Most of the damage was done to the mine rollers that attach to the front of the big mine-resistant vehicles that we drove, and thank God for those, because that armored technology, without a doubt, saved lives. Back in Iraq, OIF-1, where we're still driving around light-skinned vehicles, we all just would have died, But now those vehicles can take a direct hit. Folks are going to get banged up inside, but they're going to walk out of that, or survive it. And such was the case in Operation Shrimp Net. We had a lot of damage done to the mine rollers, and like wheels and axles would be blown off some of the mine-resistant vehicles that the sapper soldiers were operating.
Okay. But part of it is also the mine rolls. I mean, part of what that does is that's going to detonate mines. So you're in that sense, you're being successful. You're finding the mines.
Yeah, and they're more than mines. They're IEDs, which could be anywhere from 40 pounds plus of explosives, whether it's homemade explosive or artillery shells left over from the Russian invasion of the 80s. I mean, they get creative with this stuff. And, everybody's seen Hurt Locker or, heard of the movie, and it's not uncommon for them to daisy chain or series together artillery shells. So anybody who's been on the receiving end of one artillery shell could just imagine the effect of, if you had 5 or 6 of those series together and they all detonate at the same time, it's a large explosion.
Now, as far as you know, were these things that were actually command detonated by somebody watching you? Were they?
Some of them are. The big threat in southwestern Afghanistan was what they call a pressure plate IED, which basically 2 pieces of metal come together, make an electronic connection. It ignites and detonates the explosive charge. And the sheer weight of the vehicles we drive are definitely, they know how to place the pressure plates. Like I say, there's typically one route into a location and one route back. You don't have to be, you don't have to put a lot of thought into where you're going to place the IED. The technology that we had was anything from, basic metal mine detecting to ground penetrating radar to devices that can actually detect wires in the ground, for the command wire type IEDs. So a lot of technology. And we did get very high success rates with that, and that's something we tracked pretty closely, was our detection rate versus our, finding the IEDs the hard way rate. And we had about a 70 to 80% detection rate. So 3 out of 10 IEDs we found the hard way. The rest of them we would find on the routes or, wherever they emplaced them. The sappers would use a robot to emplace C4 explosives on the IED and just blow it in place. Everybody walks away happy at that point.
Yeah. Of course, still 3 out of 10 on some level that can wear down your equipment.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And all of that equipment had been in theater for, 2 or 3 rotations before us, and it was, and all of it had been hit. There wasn't any piece of equipment that hadn't been hit. We had really good maintenance support from the contractors that basically manufactured the equipment, and we had weekly video conferences with the Tank and Automotive Command, TACOM, which is actually out of Warren, Michigan. So we developed a really good relationship with TACOM, Michigan, I guess it was a Michigan thing, and if we needed something, we got it. It would take a little while in some cases, but we maintained above a 90% operational rate, which is pretty phenomenal in combat operations, considering the abuse and the hits that our soldiers and equipment took.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the rate of just normal wear and tear driving around almost.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Now, were the people doing the repairs, were they the people out of your own maintenance company, or did you have civilian contractors doing that?
Both. For the real specified route clearance equipment, it was predominantly all contractors, unless it was just like changing a tire or basic maintenance. But like our field support company would run combat logistics patrols out to different locations, all of that equipment was maintained by that company itself. We have a platoon of mechanics that do nothing but maintain that equipment. Pretty much everything else was maintained by the contractors.
Okay. And so how does the physical relationship work between the contractors and the military? Do they stay in the same base with you?
They do.
Or, okay.
They do, and it's key to develop those relationships early on. It's easy to get antagonistic with one another because, emotions are running high and patience is running low. But we had a really good working relationship with, I would say, 9 out of the 10 contractors. There were a couple that we just, we had, look, you're not doing what we need, and we would escalate that up through the chain of command, and sometimes it would result in the contractors being replaced. I mean, that's how serious that type of stuff was taken. But all in all, the maintenance went very well. It was challenging, trying to get parts out to very remote locations. Was sometimes you had to fly them by helicopter, sometimes you had to convoy them out. But to the contractor's credit, they would get on a helicopter with a couple mechanics and a box of parts and fly out to wherever our guys were at and fix the stuff on the spot and get it operational again. And as the battalion XO, I spent a lot of my time focusing on maintenance. I mean, that's just one of the things that an XO does. Right. But I had a good maintenance warrant officer, and we had really good working relationships with the different contractors that were part of that. Operationally, in Regional Command West, that was where the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force operated out of. Camp Leatherneck was their division or MEF headquarters. Right next to Camp Leatherneck was Camp Bastion, which was the NATO, primarily British force headquarters. there was a big airfield at Camp Bastion. I'm not a big royal family fan, but Prince Harry was there, and there were a couple Prince Harry sightings. The base Bastion did get infiltrated and overrun. I want to say several months into the deployment, maybe January or February of 2013, that infiltration destroyed 3 or 4 Marine Corps Harriers. The Marine Corps lost several Marines. Most of them were aviators, and I think in return we took out 30+ Taliban that infiltrated. But that was a big deal. Camp Leatherneck and Bastion hadn't been hit for over a year and a half, and then all of a sudden, we stepped out of our command post one evening after hearing a couple explosions, looked over at the airfield, which was about 1.5 miles away, and could see tracer fire and just explosions, fire, you name it. So that was quite an event. We predominantly in Regional Command West, that was Italian and Spanish led, and that's Herat and Farah, which basically border Iran. We did a lot of counter-IED operations on Route 1 or Highway 1, the ring road that basically goes 360 around the country of Afghanistan, from Camp Bastion all the way up to Herat and Farah north. There was a bad spot between Bastion and Herat called the Devil's Elbow, and it was literally just seeded with IED after IED. It reminded me of what the ground might look like after a B-52 bomber carpet bombing strike. That was a key piece of terrain for I don't want to say Taliban, but for the opium producers and distributors. And believe me, Afghanistan is all about opium production. So they needed to maintain that particular corridor free of any sort of Afghan or coalition forces to move the opium into Eastern Europe, basically. And they fought for it hard. I actually, coming back from an air base called Shindan, which is almost directly between Herat and Farah, I was on a convoy, and we were headed south back toward Camp Leatherneck, and the wrecker, or the military recovery vehicle directly in front of us, was hit by an IED. We were literally on the tailgate of that wrecker because the IED was in place in about a 3 or 4 foot crater that you had to slow down to before you went down into it and came up the other side. So typically we wouldn't bunch up in a convoy like that, but in that particular case we were bumper to bumper. The IED went off, and I just remember chunks of asphalt coming down the gunner turret, bouncing all over the inside of the vehicle I was in. Fortunately, none of our guys were hurt other than some ringing ears. The IED did little damage to the vehicle. We wound up staying on that site because we saw additional command wires and potential other IEDs. Stayed there almost for 12 or 15 hours. Got into a exchanged gunfire that night. Just they shot at us, we shot back at them. Some other civilian fuel trucks that were stacked up behind us were hit with RPGs and exploded. It was just kind of I call that a very fiery night. And I know I'm kind of bouncing around, but the point is that you can be moving along relatively peacefully at a good rate of speed, and all of a sudden things will go to hell. And anybody who's been in combat, will tell you the same thing. I mean, you're just bored one minute and in sheer terror the next. Right. And such was the case that night.
Okay. Now, did you stay in kind of that same area with that assignment for the full time you were in there?
We did.
Okay. Over the course of that time, was this a year or more or less?
It was a year.
Okay. Did the situation change at all? Did things get any better or worse or stay the same?
I think they stayed about the same. We had about cleared 250 IEDs within about a 10-month time frame. We built a lot of bridges, repaired a lot of bridges, but the actual situation on the ground, I didn't see a lot of change. And that's, the southern part of Afghanistan, Kandahar, which we were only, a couple hundred kilometers away from, is that is the historic political center of influence for the Taliban. And we're right in the middle of that. And it's also the largest opium production area in the world. And again, everything was so about the opium production that really, yes, we killed and captured a lot of Taliban. We cleared a lot of IEDs. We, did all the stuff that the military is good at doing, but as far as securing that area or making it Taliban free, I'm going to say it stayed neutral for that time period.
All right. How much of a presence do the Afghan military have in that area?
Quite a bit, actually. They're, I want to say it's the 205th Corps of the Afghan National Army is down there. They had the ANCOP Civil Order Police down there. They had Border Patrol. They had regular Afghan police forces in place. And they were doing their job. Same went for the western part of the country. But at that point, our strategy was somewhat defined by the Commander-in-Chief, President Obama, making it clear that we wanted to pull out by 2014. So a big part of our focus in 2012 and 2013 was supporting the closure of bases to reduce the military footprint in that area of Afghanistan. Everybody knew what was going on. And to a large part, the message that we're sending is, just wait it out. In a couple of years, don't worry about it. The NATO and American forces will be gone or predominantly gone, and it's just business as usual at that point. And for the Afghan army and the Afghan police, that means, they got to figure out a way to survive post NATO support. And that means they'll probably go back to the same thing they were doing prior to 2003, which is, making the deals with the drug lords. The Taliban may rear their ugly head again. I don't know. Afghanistan has a very predictable history and future.
Right. Okay. Now, when you're in this area, were you working a lot with the other American or NATO forces? Would they go with
Oh, yeah.
you?
Yeah, absolutely. We worked a lot with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Forces. They had an Engineer Battalion as well. We conducted daily operations and planning with them. We also supported the British infantry units that were operating in RC, Regional Command Southwest, which is, I think, is very cool. Anytime you get to work with NATO or international forces and other branches of the military, that's what contemporary operations are all about these days. And in the West, we work predominantly with the Italians and the Spanish. We had a small command post, we call it a TAC, which was only 5 or 6 of our, we had the senior person out there was a captain, an operations officer, and then he had like an intelligence NCO and a operations NCO, and then a couple of other soldiers just to help him out. But we had a 5 or 6 man TAC out in RC West just to embed with the planning that the Italians and the Spanish brigades were, getting engaged in. And I will say that's something we did better than our predecessors, is that we clearly made the planning piece of it, a NATO event, multinational event, versus just an Army event.
And what kind of impression did you have of the NATO allies?
They, even though our planning processes are kind of the same, there's a different perception of time, I think is a way to put it. Afghan time is inshallah, or as God wills, you know. So you can plan something and the Afghans may or may not, you know, show up for hours after the start time. We found the Italians and the Spanish to be great allies and very serious about what they were doing, but somewhat inflexible on their plans. Americans kind of pride themselves on, we got a plan, we know it's not going to survive first contact, we'll just adjust from that. We found that the Italians and Spanish, once they made a plan, that was it. You know, and you must do the plan, you can't deviate from it, which never, you know, played out to fruition. Things always change. And then the Marine Corps, they plan on such a short time cycle that it's hard to keep up with them. You know, Army is a little bit more deliberate in their planning processes. We can do short suspense or short-term planning, but the Marine Corps, literally, that's how they roll. Hey, you know, 24 hours, boom, you know, and we're like, whoa, wait a minute, you know, we need a little bit more time to, you know, we're covering an area the size of Wyoming. You guys are covering the area the size of, you know, a third of Wyoming. So those were the differences. And the British were probably the most like the Army planning cycle and processes, just very, very deliberate, methodical, and they'd be more than willing to adjust if the circumstances arose.
And they'd show up on time.
And they show up on time, yes.
All right. Are there, now, over the course of that year, I mean, how did your unit, I guess your two companies in particular, the ones out of your own, how did those people hold up over the course of the year?
Pretty good. I would say about 50% of those soldiers was their first deployment. Everybody else had deployed one or more times. So the first-time deployers, a lot of those young soldiers joined the National Guard of the military post 9/11 so that they could deploy. So their motivation was good, and they knew what they were about. I think some of them thought they were going to be in a little bit more combat type environment, and, you know, meaning they were going to do more infantry type related missions, but really, unless you were out on the route clearance patrols, you were in more of a sustainment or planning type function, which is the case for a battalion headquarters. I mean, we're there to plan, we're there to support, you know, and then typically there's like a platoon that will move the battalion commander and the command sergeant major around the battlefield, so to speak, and those are really the only guys that get into it. But having said that, when several of our combat logistics patrols, you know, did encounter IEDs, they got shot at, you know, so when they were on convoys is when they mixed it up a little bit with whoever was their nemesis. We did have one of our medic vehicles was coming back from one of the FOBs south of Camp Leatherneck, got hit by an IED. Those were some of our first casualties. We didn't lose anybody at that point, but we had several wounded, you know, just from the blast and the force of the blast. We did lose 2 soldiers from South Dakota. That was in early December. I believe they were on Highway 1, and they encountered a very, very large IED, 100 pounds or more, and it hit directly underneath the vehicle they were in and essentially destroyed the vehicle. And so we had two soldiers that were KIA, and to the credit of that's a tough one. I mean, whenever you lose soldiers, it's tough enough having soldiers wounded. It's a life-changing event when you have soldiers that are killed in action. On that particular day, our battalion commander was not at Camp Leatherneck. So when we got the word that, you know, we had 2 soldiers that were likely KIA and the medevac was en route back to Camp Leatherneck, I was basically, as XO, second in command, running the show at that point, which is by design. You know, I personally had to do the body identification and, you know, some of the other events that are associated with that. But to the credit of the Marine Corps and the British at the, you know, they run the mortuary affairs, the Marine Corps had a mortuary affairs detachment. They set up what's called a ramp ceremony where the coffins of the fallen service members are loaded onto a cargo plane, flag draped. The support we got from the entire NATO forces and the Marine Corps was one of the most emotional, moving events I think I can remember in my 30 years of the military. We had soldiers, airmen, Marines, British forces, NATO forces lined up for hundreds of yards as our 2 soldiers' coffins were loaded into the back of the C-130. And in addition, about a week later, we did a fallen soldier ceremony for the company itself, and just supported beyond description by everybody. But that was probably the low point of the deployment. You know, everybody picks up and drives on after that, including the company that lost the soldiers. They were back on the road doing missions within days, and it's just the unfortunate part of route clearance operations.
Right. Okay. Now we talked some about the sort of the first-time deployers and kind of, you know, how they held up and so forth. Were there cases where people who were on second or third deployments or whatever, where maybe they'd been there long enough, would that wear down on them, or were they holding up pretty well too?
I think not. We didn't really see after we lost the 2 soldiers from South Dakota. We had 1 soldier that took it very, very hard, and we actually had to send him home. He just was not going to be functional for the duration of the deployment. But everybody else, I mean, we didn't have like battle stress or psychological type events were kind of rare. And there was a clinic, a battle fatigue and stress clinic on Camp Leatherneck, that it was mandatory if you got hit with an IED that you spent 2 or 3 days in that battle stress clinic before you went back out on a patrol. And that just helped the soldiers, you know, chill out a little bit, get their heads together. But yeah, all in all, the Task Force Warhammer soldiers performed phenomenally. I mean, just would make you proud, really.
All right. Now, are there other particular incidents or things that took place in that year that kind of stand out for you that you haven't brought in the story yet?
Yeah, the bridge company that was attached to us or in our task organization was the 132nd Multi-Role Bridge Company out of California, Northern California. I can't remember exactly where, but just a phenomenal group of soldiers. They had several large bridging missions, and military bridges are really like big erector sets. They go together component by component, and they did several of those which were noteworthy. One of them was called Operation Golden Gate, kind of a, you know, paying homage to their state of California, but that was a big multinational NATO event. They built 2 bridges across the Helmand River, which was starting to rise in the spring because of the snowmelt from the mountain ranges, and it was making it almost impossible for military forces to cross the existing bridge, and also for the locals to get, you know, their goods and services across the river as well. So that was pretty noteworthy. The ironic part of that operation is it was about a month long, just a beautiful piece of engineering and bridging planning. You know, a couple weeks after we put that bridge in, we started to get reports back that the bridge was falling into disrepair, and we're like, wait a minute, something's not right here. So we sent some patrols out, learned that the police checkpoint there was, charging a toll to cross the river, which they're not supposed to do. And also that, some of the pins and the bolts holding the bridge together were missing. And we learned that the local populace was removing them and selling them or using them for their farm or making IEDs or whatever. But they apparently knew enough about bridging engineering to only remove pieces that wouldn't cause the collapse of the bridge. But anyway, one bank to the other. And usually you do that when the span of the river is too far or too long to use a military bridge. The structural integrity of the bridge just won't hold up because of the distance between gap to gap or bank to bank. So yeah, a lot of rafting operations. The Marine Corps and the British had armor, tanks and other armored vehicles. So we'd put a M1 tank on a raft, push it from one side or the other, which is very cool. I mean, you can go your whole military career and never see that. And we got the opportunity to do some of those type of operations and support. So very impressed with that bridge company.
Okay. All right. So now what happens now at the end of the deployment?
The end of the deployment, we did our battle handoff with the 307th Engineer Battalion, which is a battalion from the 82nd Airborne Division out of Fort Bragg. They came in, I want to say, February of 2013. And we did our relief in place with them. I guess the other piece that I was a little remiss about describing was we also had a training and advising function or operation with the Afghan engineers that were also doing route clearance. We had a team of about 12 guys that just did nothing but that and had some pretty good successes with it. The 307th wanted to do more and more of that because they saw that as a way out. We said, that's great, you will have to do that, but not at the level that you think you're going to have to do it, simply because your focus is going to be supporting more and more base closures, because that's the lay of the land in 2013 and 14. So, every commander comes in with a different philosophy and set of priorities, but when you hand off the battlefield to the next group of guys, it's theirs. They can basically do with it whether they want to listen to the guys who just finished up the tour or not. It doesn't matter.
Right.
But
okay, so when do you get back to the States?
we got back to the States early March, went back to Fort Bliss, and the same thing. You go through the medical out processing. This time they actually had us go through a series of neurological tests. They sit you behind a computer, and it's kind of like mind memory, timed events, and it was more critical to the guys who had been hit by IEDs, myself included. They just wanted to measure if there was any neurological, difference between the baseline tests we took before we went into the theater and when we came back.
So that's kind of the concussion issue or something
Exactly.
like that? Yeah.
Traumatic brain injury,
Right.
I think, is the medical
Official term
term,
for
but
it, yeah.
TBI. But anyway, administrative, medical, some briefings on how to build a resume and find a job, that kind of stuff. And then we flew back into Battle Creek, Michigan, had a tremendous welcome by the Battle Creek and Kalamazoo localities. We were at, I want to say, either Portage Northern or Portage Central high schools. Filled up the gymnasium with about 2,000 people. Said our hurrah speeches and reunited with our families. So that would have been March of 2013. So literally just a little about a year from today. Actually, we're February 20th, so almost a year ago today we were still in Afghanistan, but getting ready to push out.
Right. And then how quickly do things go back into the regular guard routine after that?
You get about 60 to 90 days off, I guess is the best way to put it. That turns out to be the situation for most of the soldiers, but for me, I think I got a couple weeks off, and then, we have this event and that event. I went to a couple of senior leader planning courses up at, or not courses, conferences in Grayling. I found out about a month after we got back from Afghanistan that I was going to take command of the 507th Engineer Battalion. So I had to go to a pre-command course out at Fort Leonard Wood. That was a couple weeks long, and then, good Lord, by then it was May or June timeframe, and we were back into our normal training regimen for a National Guard unit.
Okay, and at what point do you become commander of the battalion?
I took command in June of 2013, and Lieutenant Colonel, who's actually Colonel promotable, Bill Meyer, went back to his original assignment at the National Guard Bureau in Washington, D.C. So yeah, I took command in June. It's a great honor. Anytime you're in command is truly an honor. I love working with soldiers, and I have quite a history with the 507th, and it was just a great opportunity. I will say I wasn't the first choice, but the guy who was the first choice had not completed his Command and General Staff College that I referred to, a while back.
Because that's necessary for anyone to go to that rank.
Yeah, it is. There's if you don't do the resident course like I did, the year-long resident course, you have to do, I think, 3 or 4 phases of that, and he hadn't completed his last phase. So, he and I are great friends, and we just slapped high fives, and he's like, "Well, you wound up with the 507th." I'm like, "Yeah, it's just the way things work out." So,
all right. We managed to kind of get ourselves up to date after only about 4 hours of interviewing. That's really not so bad.
Yep.
I'd just like to close by thanking you for taking the time to come in and talk today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.